everyone, and welcome to the Geneva Dialogue Podcast, a first in a series of podcast conversations this year, where we discuss responsible behavior in cyberspace, implementation of cyber norms, and possible roles and responsibilities in this regard of different stakeholder groups and actors. For those who might not be familiar, Geneva Dialogue is an international process led by the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and implemented by DiploFoundation in partnership with Center for Digital Trust. I am your host today. My name is Anastasia Kazakova. I'm a cyber diplomacy knowledge fellow at Diplo, and I'm thrilled to learn today from two great experts with so many years of professional experiences behind the bags who will help us today unpack more about vulnerabilities in digital products, risks that might come from vulnerable code, and I'm also going to ask them why users should even care about security and cybersecurity these days. So our guests today are Serge Droz, Senior Advisor in the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs Digitalization Division, as well as Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of FIRST. FIRST is a global forum of incident response and security teams. And also with us today, Justas Vilgalys, Product Security Lead at Broadon. Thank you so much, Serge and Justas, for being here today. I'm going to be today in the shoes of a regular user, which actually I am as well. And just going straight to the first question, I wonder why actually vulnerabilities in digital products bad. We see lots of the media headlines, right, every day. The vulnerabilities grow each year, that different vulnerabilities are discovered, reported in the devices, in the apps that we use. But I bet many people just scroll over this news. They might be not too relevant for them or too technical. And I wonder if the vulnerabilities are actually that irrelevant for us as users. And when vulnerabilities actually become more relevant and might have really bad consequences for us as users.
Well, thanks, Nastia, for having me and Justas here. Let me maybe jump in on the first question on why should everybody care really about vulnerabilities. There's kind of two parts to these questions, I feel. The first part is really about yourself. It's about the very users. In the past 20 years since I've been working in this field of cybersecurity, I've often heard the term, there's nothing I have to hide. There's nothing that is valuable to the bad guys that I have. And nothing could be further from the truth. And there's things like your money that's available through your computer. So people tend to rob banks, and if you have vulnerabilities on your systems, they can abuse them to actually get at your money. Maybe you say the money is going to be replaced by the bank, have a very generous bank. There's things that cannot be replaced. For example, all your digital pictures of your family, of your kids growing up. Maybe there's information you don't want to be shared, like your medical history, which may sit on your devices. And in fact, that is exactly what a lot of the criminals are behind. To make matters worse, if you actually a civil rights activist in one of the many countries where civil liberties aren't guaranteed, and sometimes even in those countries, authoritarian regimes and overzealous kind of civil officers may start spying on you, and they often do this by exploiting vulnerabilities. I guess the most famous example of that is the Pegasus spyware, which was sold to a multitude of shady users who then really terribly abused this, sometimes leading to people being killed. And yes, normal users are probably not going to get this, but it's just a part in the chain. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that if you're not really sure that your devices are safe, you will start losing trust in these devices. I mean, who's going to do online shopping? Who's going to do online banking? Who's going to use the internet for anything remotely sensitive if you cannot be sure that your data is trust? So I think if we have vulnerabilities in products, it undermines the trust in cyberspace. And that's something that we want to avoid, because cyberspace really, at the end of the day, is a great place to bring people there.
Nice intro there, Serge. And first of all, before I go any further, thank you, Nastia, for having us. Well, I work at Proton, and really, in my opinion, vulnerabilities do impact us users. the Serge mentioned the Pegasus thing, but even before Pegasus, we've been being inundated with ransomware, and things like that. And if you've ever been hit by that, it's pretty bad. Someone takes over your computer or the device that you use to communicate with people, and then they ask for money in return. And they're criminals, so you have no guarantee to get to it. And that's one of the main reasons why we have to be concerned about vulnerabilities. Historically, you have to remember the devices that we use and the whole infrastructure for the internet was built with the best intentions in mind. When CERN scientists invented, the World Wide Web, it was to help people communicate together. And that was the goal. It was simply to have people talk to each other. And over the years, we built on top of it. And of course, the concern becomes that if there is a bug or a problem with the way that it's built, some people who may want to hurt us will find out how they can leverage those type of issues. So I think that's the big concern. So I think it really is a consumer specific issue that we all should be caring about. Running high quality products when we're using our internet, when we're using cell phones, when we're ordering cabs, and to make certain that the companies behind these products are legitimate and that they're doing everything possible to keep us and our information safe.
Thank you so much. I resonate a lot with what you both said, especially the trust part, that cyberspace is actually such a really great place to enjoy so many benefits. But still, there's a dangers that we should be aware of. But I also wonder, again, as a user, retrospectively, vulnerabilities that something exists for many years, right? And I'm curious how the companies and the private actors and the industry learning to be better dealing with vulnerabilities. So if you could share, given your experiences, what has been the path historically industry to deal with vulnerabilities, and still what are the key challenges for companies these days to ensure the best security for the users?
Well, it seems to me that the private sector learned dealing with vulnerabilities the hard way. It's 20 years ago, nobody was taking this stuff seriously. Everybody was saying kind of like, who would ever do something like this when you told them somebody's exploiting a vulnerability? And I think the organization I got hit most really was Microsoft, leading to this really still worthwhile memo of Bill Gates about why the company needs to transform. And I think it's a really interesting memo to read, because it's not about security is really important. It's about people will lose trust in our products and they'll stop buying these products. And so Microsoft was one of the first companies to really start, and then we had all these wars with other companies saying, "Oh, our products are safe," until they were told, kind of demonstrated otherwise. And still today, I think we have a lot of tech companies, especially the kind of the new kids on the block, all these Internet of Things company that are in a startup mode where they want to grow fast and they don't have time for security, that are terribly bad in dealing with vulnerabilities. And I think the big players really understood the rules of the games and they react quite quickly and responsibly. So no complaints about that. But many of the new organizations, unless they really have security kind of on the front, tend to make the same mistakes that many of the today established organizations made 20 years ago. And that's to some extent a bit saddening that we have to kind of repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And now it's not your laptop or your desktop that has a vulnerability, it's your fridge, it's your fish tank, it's your light bulb and whatnot. And then people come and tell me, but who would like to hack my light bulb? And well, nobody's really interested in your light bulb, but they may be interested in actually getting into your internal network through your light bulb. And that's exactly what's happening.
So it's an interesting world we live here. In many ways, the promises of technology has not simplified our lives. It was supposed to make our jobs easier. That was like one of the goals of the internet and computer automation in general. And in many ways, it made simple tasks better. and made us more efficient because of that. If you think of it's the world we live today, we have Alexis and Siri talking with us. We have ChatGPT, who's able to rewrite our documents and take our notes and make them presentable. Those are all great advances of them, but they're also very powerful, and it's something that you have to watch out for. So I saw some great examples on people using ChatGPT to cause negative impacts. When it first came out, people were able to quickly figure out how to train the thought process on a ChatGPT to influence the results. And we were able to do things, or people were able to do things like give harmful or derogatory responses to common questions that somebody might ask. It's all the way you want to utilize the machines. But let's step back a little bit more and figure out, how do we get there? The World Wide Web in many ways was an open environment. When we were designing cars, when we were designing planes and industrial systems, we basically had a very, very high bar. Planes weren't supposed to fall out of the sky. Cars aren't supposed to be running off the road, and it's supposed to have safety mechanisms on that. There were no guardrails when software was being built. And the guardrails came afterwards. And that's in some ways what we're doing, what we're trying to catch up with. And what bad actors do, be them criminal enterprises, be them nation states who are trying to update secrets, for industrial or for foreign governments. What they loved about vulnerabilities is that they kind of gave them a back door on the ability to use the device, and you might ask, well, who are these people who are thinking about that? If you ever have a neighbor or a friend who would love to take apart the toaster oven or disassemble a watch, those are the first steps in a person who becomes a great security researcher or a hacker, because they're interested in how things work. So, and when you find out how things work, you can find out where, hey, wait a second, something's not working the way it's supposed to be. And really, that's what vulnerability is in a product. It means that something's not working the way it's supposed to be, and then a bad actor can possibly be able to take advantage of it. And that's that's one of the key parts about vulnerabilities is that, and that's why commercial enterprises and the digital people have to be concerned about it, because although we have the best of intentions, that everywhere I've ever worked, we always think of the customer and the planet in mind. A simple bug or a simple thing that could be abused in the wrong way will have negative consequences, and it could be to the individual, it could be to your company, it could be to the planet. So we want to fix those things, and right now, in many ways, we're putting those guardrails together. For the internet, we're trying to make it a safer place as we're cruising, as everybody's using it. So it's a pretty exciting time to be in the industry of software and everything.
It's good that you both mentioned the toaster and IoT things. I just recalled my personal experience when I was last time at IKEA. I noticed so many new cool things. I don't know if I call them IoT, but actually new audio systems, wireless, that might be connected to the internet. And they're so cheap, much cheaper than the specialized electronic magazine. And of course, when the jack is so exciting and cheap, I must admit that I did not think thoroughly of security features built in. So I assume that many other people actually really do not think. But it's good that you mentioned that there's a lot of still hidden downsides that we do not care as humans is, but they're really real. The access that bad actors might have to personal data, to financial data, or to connect through possibly this poorly secure systems, which is always a case, to other systems in your smart home. But I also still have the questions. Good also you mentioned about the best intentions. And I want to take, Serge, why you mentioned that still companies make mistakes, still have vulnerabilities. And I wonder why actually it still might be hard to deal with vulnerabilities promptly. What are the sort of the top challengers for different actors in the field?
That's a really good question. It's a hard question to kind of answer completely. But I think there's several sides to this One is that writing software is not too difficult, but writing secure software is actually quite a bit of a challenge. And if you're a startup, your initial kind of goal is speed. You wanna have a product that you can bring to the market. And a lot of these kind of new things are coming to the market from little startups that hope then later to be bought by a big company. And so you don't really pay attention to this. And also, I think students today, computer science students and developers, they don't really learn secure development. They learn development. And I think that is something we could change. Universities should increasingly start teaching people writing secure software. And I mean, it's not rocket science. It's just a little more tedious. And it's like everything. Jotting down a couple of notes is easier than actually writing a nice document that is actually presentable. And maybe the large language models are going to help us here. So that's one part. But regardless of how good you developers are, you're always going to make mistakes because these systems are complex. They consist of components that interact in unforeseen ways. And that, of course, makes it really, really hard for suppliers to use secure software because they don't really know how the customers are going to use this. This is kind of leading us towards this whole thing about supply chains. Nobody today controls the full tech stack that they actually deploy, not even the biggest companies such as Microsoft or Google. I mean, they all depend on third parties. Again, that's something you just have to live with, and you have to live with implies that you need mechanisms and processes to deal with vulnerabilities should they arise. And I think that increasingly companies start to understand that they need to do this properly. And that starts with having, for example, security information available. If you find a security vulnerability, how can you report it? There's still too many companies where you cannot report this. Or where you kind of get accused of being a hacker or a criminal when you report this. And of course, those things then usually turn bad. But again, the bigger companies, I think, all have programs where you can report this responsibly. Then you can go to the next step, and I'm pretty sure Justas has much more to say. You can actually actively invite people to look at the security of your products and report them. That's what we call bug bounty programs. But again, you see a huge diversity and maturity in this space. There are some companies that do this really well. They spend tons of money. And there's others that just like, if you try to phone them and tell them, hey, there's a security issue, in the best of all cases, they look strange at you. In the worst of cases, they actually start threatening you. And just remember that the Swiss government set out hundreds of traditional paper letters to companies telling them, you have a security problem. This wasn't about vulnerabilities most of the time. It was about unpatched or unfixed vulnerabilities. Can you imagine that in this day and age, you still have to write paper letters, half of which get ignored? I find this quite disturbing.
Boy, having moved to Switzerland, man, this country loves paper. Everything that goes on, be it banking or my apartment, everything, it's all, you have to sign a paper, you have to get a document in the mail, so it's interesting, but that works. I think back to my mother and father used to pay their insurance with a little ticket every single month and a check that they put in the mail. Guess what? That was secure because it required the post office, and the post office is reliable. So that was kind of neat. I want to agree with first of all with what Serge says. You have so many great insights, and it's an honor to be speaking with you here. But it's an ecosystem problem, and it's growing so big that no one understands it all. I spent most of my career working at Microsoft in the Windows environment, and it's so complex that very few people understand the majority of it. You can count the people on one hand who are the original architects who are able to really delve in and understand every single component in such a complex environment. And even they, no longer, they rely on many people to make certain that they're educated and up to date on the changes that are happening there. So it's very, very difficult to keep abreast of what's changing, and also to be able to respond. You mentioned, the organizations working together, Serge, and Serge is very much involved in FIRST, which stands for Incident Response. It's like, it's a great organization, and many, many large companies are involved in it. And the goal is to communicate together so that we can help address the bigger issues that may impact us and keep us secure. And it's how to respond to concerns. Serge mentioned the bug bounty program. There's way more proactive things going on today than that. And really, the bug bounty in many ways is a way to invite the community into into helping us create great products. In addition to that, one of the great things that came out of Europe, and Microsoft was originally against this, and ever since Satya Nadella has been their CEO, they embraced it, is open source software. It turns out that if you put your software out in public and there's a problem with how it's written, people are going to fix the problem. People are good people, kind people, are going to say, hey, this routine or the way that you're calculating this is incorrect. You may want to fix that. And those suggestions get into it. And really, for that, and that's, is a double-edged goal. It adds a dependency to our database. We make our information available open source. We let other companies use it, so we get more users, so we're getting more usage out of it. But then if a problem is found, or if there's an exploit within it, more people have to respond to it. And that whole area is called vulnerability management and dependency chains. And they've been in the news in the past year or so for large type of vulnerabilities that have impacted lots of people. It makes it more complex. So.
Thank you so much for such a really comprehensive overview. I think that's super insightful. But I also wonder that, of course, that's predictable that our companies themselves not expected to eliminate all the potential security issues, right? So there are other actors that might support, and you already mentioned about researchers, the technical community, the bug bounty programs that might actually help coordinate efforts between them. And I wonder that the researchers, while looking for vulnerabilities and conducting vulnerability research, what will be considered as the ethical or non-ethical? What actually makes vulnerability research more ethical so that they could be more trusted by companies, for instance, to open up the systems and thus to be more on alert that potential vulnerabilities might be found, and thus more security could be ensured for users?
So Serge is the one who brought me to Proton, by the way, and it really was to deal with a lot of the interactions that you're talking about here. The difference between a good hacker or an ethical hacker and a bad one, it's a fine line, because like human beings, everybody has attitudes. An ethical hacker is one who's going to be working with the industry to create better products and to make our products and lives more secure. And the way that they do that is through a good coordinated disclosure process, which is one of the basis for being able to communicate how to properly find an issue. So a company such as Proton, Microsoft, Google, we have publicly available security response centers and bug bounty programs that any researcher can search, that can find, and then contact us through the appropriate means. If those don't work, if you're a smaller company, when I find bugs on other products that we're using, I'll try telling them to their support team if they have a support alias or something like that. So it's one way is how do you communicate them? And then the other way is how do you disclose it and how do you get credit for it? So one of the big thing about bug bounty hunters is, yes, they get paid or award for when they submit an issue to us. But from a practical sense, a really good qualified bug bounty has a day job. They're working as a security researcher at Swiss.com. They're working as as an engineer in an aerospace planes or in an aerospace company or something like that. But they are also curious because they're the guys who took apart the toaster oven as little kids, and they found issues with the products that they're using. So they have a way to report it. And really, it's the responsible disclosure that becomes key. And what that means is that you're going to be, instead of taking credit and going public with your findings right away, which some hackers love to do, by the way, because it builds up their reputation. Hey, look at the bugs that I found. They're really, really complicated and they're real life issues. Instead of doing that, they are being a little more ethical and working with the community to resolve the issues. And some of these issues are very complex. They can take, years to require. They can impact hundreds of companies. And imagine like when you're playing a game where you have to make 100 moves at the same time. It's not one move. It's not me saying, hey, you have a bug, Microsoft. It's me telling Microsoft that there's a bug. Oh, by the way, Apple and Google is also impacted by the same bug. And then, by the way, because of that, every single enterprise company is going to have to be able to fix it at the same time. Otherwise, once that issue becomes known publicly, this is the other half of it, that you have to keep the entire industry up to date and current. Because as soon as you go public, as soon as Microsoft releases that patch Tuesday or whatever, the fixes for security issues, the bad guys are going to reverse engineer those fixes, and they're going to incorporate them into their attack techniques, and they're going to go ahead and get anyone who's not patched. They're going to be looking for people who weren't up to date with their security fixes and things like that. So to summarize, that's the difference, really. It's like an ethical hacker wants to work with the industry, with the ecosystems, and with human beings to make us safer, while an unethical hacker wants to either monetize it for personal the issues that they found via the dark web, or by selling it to nation states, maybe working for nation states also. Because it's an espionage type of, exploits can be used in espionage and so on. Or they're doing it for self-fulfillment because they can say, hey, look what I found, and I'll make the planet at risk to be able to show off my capabilities.
I think there's also many cases that I've seen where people were actually well-meaning, but just overstepped certain lines. I remember that a very long time ago, there was a fairly big vulnerability that my team at the time was kind of researching, and we were doing kind of investigations to figure out if our customers had problems or not. And what we did is we were essentially running so-called proof of concept code. So that means we were trying to exploit the vulnerability. But what we didn't consider is that this may have side effects. So if you start working these vulnerabilities, you use a product in a way that wasn't foreseen, and quite often the consequences or the reaction of the system behind this is unforeseen. And the internet today is not only a website that's then going to disappear. It may actually be a medical device may stop. It may be a power supply that's going to or a power grid that's going to go down. And I feel it's very, very important that security researchers are aware of the fact that they can cause damage, that they really take precautions and make sure they don't cause unwanted side effects, in particular in systems where they haven't been invited to do so. There's often kind of like these comparisons where people say, oh, if you don't lock your door and somebody tries to open the house, then that's not okay, or it's okay. And then there's a discussion, is this okay or not? But I think I would go further and say, this is more like people's trying to smash a window to see if it's secure. And that certainly is not okay. And the same holds in the internet. I really feel that security researchers, not only should they kind of, once they find a vulnerability, disclose it responsibly, they also should make sure that while finding these and while researching these, they don't do additional damage. The same goes actually on calls for journalists. I've seen cases where journalists were tipped off on certain vulnerabilities, and then they started to kind of proof of concept download information, download very private and confidential information. I think this is not okay. It's totally unethical. Just because you can grab someone's, I don't know, health files doesn't mean you should do it. And so there's a lot of things that people that really are serious in this space should think about. And this is really like finding a box with really confidential stuff in there that may have a lot of damage. You want to be really careful. You may suddenly have a lot of power that you need to be able to deal with, and you need to do so in a way that minimizes harm.
Good points there, Serge, for sure. It's, the guardrails, I'll call them, that companies use to protect ourselves from people overreaching like that, even if they had good intentions, are things like a vulnerability disclosure policy. That's where we and a safe harbor agreement. Those are like the legal legal entities and the rules around what ethical hacking is. And the company usually, like a Proton or someone, would define them on our websites. And we have pages that say that, and we ask the ethical hackers not to overreach. If you're researching our products, please don't bring them down and cause a denial of service. So that would be bad. If you find an issue, before taking it further, please stop and report it to us, and we'll work with you to fix it and stuff like that. So, it's that's the fun part about the security business, is you're working with very smart people, and learning about them and learning about their capabilities to try to improve our products, try to improve, the posture in the world. And as we all know, it's like, boy, would it be bad if somebody accidentally broke our heating systems or electricity grid accidentally because they were looking for a bug.
Well, listening to both of you, I might actually see, and please disagree with me, that the core challenge lies in the behavior of humans, right? And humans are complex. We as a humans are increasingly complex. And to avoid this and what are side effects, it's really difficult, because it's difficult to technically program what are the possibility and a variety of such side effects could be, because it really lies in the behavior of social creators as we are. But the question about the big elephant in the room, and Serge a little bit mentioned about the language models, do you believe that probably AI and machine learning have the potential to reduce vulnerabilities and help us to predict all this possibility of and what are side effects in using the digital products? So what's your take on that?
That's a good question. I mean, who knows where artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to take us? I think personally, I don't really think we're going to get rid of bugs. It's like every system that we develop is developed always based on assumptions. And most of the time, a bug occurs, or quite often a bug occurs because these assumptions are wrong. And some of the assumptions are, you know what you have to make, and you could work around, but then still, like take buffer overflow. Buffer overflows work on the assumption that a user has to supply some input, and the input is only going to have certain lengths, and nobody's going to type in more than that. That's the underlying assumption that gets violated. And why does it get violated? Because no sane person would do this except for a hacker, and people forget this. Now, machine learning models, they're trained on kind of user data, so they may be susceptible to the same mistakes. Who knows? They may introduce new ones. Who knows? We just don't really know. And then there's always kind of the odd bug where you say, oh, this is really novel, or it's systems that actually work properly, that just once you bring them together start developing kind of strange effects. And that's not just happening in computer science and software development. You have to start with drugs too. You take two perfectly fine kind of drugs to treat two different diseases, but when you put them together, things go wrong. It's kind of like throwing Mentos into Coke. And so I don't think we're going to be unemployed anytime soon.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to hurt that. analogy I like to use, and the term is for, and this is something you should do for any project you have, is do a basic threat model. And a threat model, answers, well, it's basically 4 questions you want to ask. What are you trying to do? What can possibly go wrong? What are you going to do about it? And then afterwards, hey, did we succeed? Did we find the problem? So you can apply that to anything. If I was going to build a fence in my backyard, the threat model would be like, hey, is the ground equal? Are the pieces of wood the same size that I'm making the fence out of? What happens to the water flow down the hill if I build a fence over here? Am I going to interrupt that? And will there be flooding on one of the sides of the fence? You can ask like 100 questions like that. And then once you solve those type of questions, then you can go ahead and say, hey, now I know what my design may implicate.
But also the question that goes probably very close to this, and it's related, I think, to AI. I just read this morning the news from the US policymakers that there's indeed the growing risk that the AI might present. So the governments need to be part of this ongoing developments in the discussion to make sure that the security ensured for the users and the new fair rules are established. And I wanted to ask you a question as well about the government's role. Someone that, as you are, you've seen how the entire industry has been developing for the past years. So what your expectations could be in this regard from the growing interest of governments to step in this area? And I'm particularly looking at the Chinese rules for vulnerability reporting and a proposal for the European Union for the Cyber Resilience Act that which might mandate the vulnerability reporting to the EU Cybersecurity Agency. And maybe you also have any thoughts how far the government's actually expected to step in this area?
So, I mean, this is a really wide area. We have this talk because there is a norm by the United Nations that says that governments should be concerned about responsible treatment or coordination of vulnerabilities. And so I think that's good news because it means that all the states in the United Nations kind of accept the fact that vulnerabilities are a bad thing and they need to be treated responsibly. But what does that mean and how do you implement this locally? This is something that varies very much from state to state. For example, Switzerland's feeling is that vulnerabilities are really bad because they undermine trust in the internet and they introduce instabilities in kind of the global fabric of cyberspace. So Switzerland kind of promises to never kind of keep a vulnerability secret. So if you report a vulnerability to Swiss government, it will make sure that it gets reported to the respective manufacturer, that it gets fixed in a responsible way. And that is actually an offer to a lot of hackers that are afraid to deal directly with organizations or to people who can't find the proper person to talk to in a private company. The Swiss government will kind of help you there. That's not the view that all governments have. There's governments in particular from the bigger countries, in particular US and UK, who reserve the right to at least keep vulnerabilities they discover themselves secret. US and UK have documented this in what's called the vulnerabilities equities process, where they kind of lay out all the thoughts they're going to make about when they keep this. It's kind of a balance between what's the damage going to be, is it already known, and stuff like this, to kind of, can we gain a digital advantage to this? Again, Switzerland feels there's a lot of things unclear and states still need to create more clarity on what this means. What's the role of the state? How should this norm that says you need to deal with vulnerabilities in a responsible way, how does this need to be implemented? There still needs to be discussions led. When it comes to regulation, which is something that especially the European Union really loves to do, again, Switzerland is a country that kind of is very hesitant regulating. We feel you should have as little regulation as necessary. In fact, we typically say to the private sector, why don't you try to fix this problem? If you don't do so, then we may consider regulation. And so regulation is something that only is supposed to come out if there's a danger of the private sector who runs and produces all of this stuff is not working out. What the regulation often tends to do is that it more regulates the how than the what. So it tries to tell the private sector how it's supposed to do things, how it's supposed to develop secure products, rather than what the expectations are, namely that customers and users don't have a problem. And I think if you try to tell the private sector on how they should fix the problem, that's not going to work out, because for that it's far too the private sector and cyberspace and cyber technology is far too dynamic. I mean, there's not a week without new technology coming out. Who half a year ago would have thought that ChatGPT would have such an impact? Nobody. And we haven't even started thinking about how to regulate this. So I think regulation is a very, very tricky thing. And I think good regulation is regulation that kind of specifies an end result, because that really is what states should be doing. They should think, what is it that citizens want? Because technically that's what politicians are elected for, to represent their citizens. I'm going to kind of promote this rather than tell people how they have to do things. It's no state would tell a car manufacturer how an engine has to work technically. They're going to say it must not use more than that much fuel, it must not produce toxic poison, it shouldn't explode, but it's not telling them how they should achieve this. And I think that is something that's really hard.
Wow. Yeah, thank you, Serge. That's this is your expertise. I'm just a layman reading the same newspaper articles that Nastya was reading. And the U.S. government did say that they're going to put together, the U.S. Senate, to be exact, Chuck Schumer, that they're going to put together some sort of policy for AI. At least they're thinking about putting together a framework on where to take it. And it's very difficult because the concepts are so abstract for the new artificial intelligence technology. I much prefer the term machine learning, because really that's what it is, where computers will never be sentient beings and they will never be able to think for themselves. However, they are able, you can train them to come up with outcomes. And that's what you want to build the guardrails or the rules about is how and what do you use to train these things? And will there be models that will be become industry standards? That's where I see that happening. You don't want to train, what would be a good example? Well, you don't want to teach the computer derogatory words, to put words in, the slang words or something like that into government documents. You want to say only use words that are officially described within that. For example, in the Air Transport Association, 30 years ago, even longer, they have what's called the simple English language. Every single maintenance manual for fixing an aircraft has to use these 110 words so that everybody can understand it. So I picture for machine learning and for building and training languages, you're going to put similar requirements saying that, that you will not train machines and you will not use training that does things that will cause harm. So what that is, we'll have to define. Of course, the bad guys are doing the opposite. They're using machine learning to see what damage they can cause or what information they can glean. So that's the other concern that we have, is that we're not the only ones playing with artificial intelligence. The bad guys are also looking at it to see how they can leverage that new technology for their benefit.
I see that you both. Sorry, yeah.
Yes, and maybe to add to the challenges of regulation, and Justas mentioned that a lot of software is open source, and I think that is a challenge for policymakers and regulators. I mean, this is true for artificial intelligence, by the way. I mean, most of these models nowadays are available in open source versions, because open source is not really owned by anyone. So the traditional thing of kind of like, you build the system, so you're responsible, doesn't really apply. Because what people say is, I got this piece of software, you can use it at your own risk. I'm not taking any responsibility. That's just a pet project of mine. And how do you put this in? How do you regulate this? This is really hard. And I don't think anyone really knows the solution about this. And I don't think the solution is regulation. I think the solution is actually more towards working with the community, working with people that are heavily involved. And I think states still have to come to grips on how they want to do this. Obviously, it's not the state's job to kind of fix every piece of software that somebody has written on a rainy Sunday. On the other hand, maybe there should be mechanisms that encourage this and that make it possible. And it's also a question that I think the private sector needs to ask. Is it really okay to kind of use the free open source software in the free sense of free beer and never give anything back and then cry out to governments, oh, you have to do something because there's a security vulnerability? These are difficult discussions. And I think they're discussions that go very much beyond kind of technical discussions. And so here is my challenge to the technical community. Technical community needs to come to grips with the fact that probably some regulation is needed, that their technology may cause a lot of problems, and that technology is many things, but certainly it's not a neutral thing that doesn't do any good or bad. It's technology influences how society works, vulnerabilities, badly written software influences how society works, and we have to come to grips with this huge multi-stakeholder ecosystem.
Yeah, good points there. Open source does try to have people do step up and become maintainers. That's like the word for it. And like for example, Proton maintains the Go crypto libraries, and it's really exciting because it means I get to work with very, very smart people, and that's a ton of fun for me. But you're right. It's like, what do you do if the maintainer goes away? Or what do you do if the maintainer is Facebook and Facebook doesn't want to fix the bug because they have their own workaround for it? You know, there's all this other stuff that gets in there. In any event, there is room for technology. There is room for government to help us with the guardrails. I think that's given. Otherwise, there's we'll all be falling off the cliff at some time without those guardrails there.
But I see that you're both actually really good at in viewing the government's role as someone that needs to set up the expectations rather than precisely write down how the process should be made. But I think also regarding the open source, there's definitely already lots of the discussions going on, at least in the US, after the famous vulnerability happened last year, right? In the open source Log4j. So that is already going, as I see, as a combined effort of the community and the policymakers of different kinds, from different agencies. So perhaps that model might be also exported to the other jurisdictions, to the other communities, and make sure that at least they also stay connected somehow to ensure that the end result will be interoperable across different jurisdictions as a result. But let's see how it goes with the current proposals in Europe, and maybe any other similar proposals to regulate the security in digital products also will come up sooner. So if that will be ensured that there's no further fragmentation between them. But Justas, you also made a good point about actually to my last question about the responsibility. And I wanted to ask, what do you feel about the liability? Should the manufacturers be liable for vulnerable code in digital products? And if users can expect remedies if vulnerabilities exist in digital products?
The short answer is it depends on what the vulnerability is and how they respond to it, to be quite honest. So when what is the biggest, the worst thing happening right now in the United States? It is the opioid addiction that's being exacerbated by fentanyl. And in my opinion, certain pharmaceutical families have gotten away scot-free with a $6 billion payment with admitting no culpability to causing all of that damage. That is a bad example what responsibility and what responsible companies should do and what responsible governments should do. If there's a vulnerability in a software product that impacts a person's well-being, if my Tesla brakes fail and when they should have been working, Tesla should be responsible for that. If my software code isn't running correctly, and it is returning improper results, in my opinion, we should be somewhat liable to it. The difference becomes on what the nature of the problem is and what the impact is. But I also believe that the response of the company should be critical in deciding whether they're culpable or not. Because as Serge mentioned, and we know, as we all know, humans make mistakes. There are code bugs being introduced when we write code, and there are external factors that could make things obsolete. So like, for example, in the Windows environment, we're not going to fix a security issue in Windows NT4 that hasn't been supported in 20 years. However, if someone reports a significant issue, it should be fixed within a reasonable amount of time via coordinated disclosure. And if there's economic impact because the company does not respond appropriately, they should be punished, because that's one of the sticks that a government has, is that if we're going to have products out there and we're going to want to have them to be safe, we're going to insist that companies resolve the issues. Yeah, I'm sure you have more to add. So thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of agree with your statement that a lot should depend on how an organization or company responds, and but this really is a tough one, and it's maybe interesting in starting to remind oneself what the legal state of software is. The legal state is actually much more closer to a book that somebody's written than to a machine that somebody's built. And I think it originally came out when people started to think about what is this legally. They looked at code and they said, oh, it's something, it looks like music scores. So we're going to use the same regime, which is intellectual property. And with intellectual property, we know that works for software. You cannot steal software, period. And now, unlike with music, software can actually break stuff. And especially if the software governs devices that then have an impact, or if they govern access to something, and that there is a challenge. But it's not as easy to say as saying just, oh, if you have mistakes and then you're responsible for the effects, because first of all, manufacturers don't really know how customers are going to use this stuff. This is really, I mean, you mentioned Windows NT, which hasn't been supported for 20 years. I'm convinced there's a gazillion critical infrastructures that still run under Windows NT. So is that really Microsoft's problem? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So we have to come to grips with this. It's the Cyber Resilience Act, in fact, demands that digital products have an expiry date, which is one way to handle this. They say, okay, a manufacturer is responsible for a certain amount of time, and then it's your fault. I think the question with software is just so much more complex than with anything else, because it is such a universal thing. You build a car to do one thing, namely that's transport people from A to B. But software can do pretty much anything. You build an operating system, you run a space station on this, you run your toaster on this, you run your toothbrush on this stuff. I mean, if you look at Linux, it's pretty much in anything. And who owns Linux? There's not even a company that owns Linux. It's we don't really know. So this really is a challenging thing. And I think what we probably need is a little more kind of thinking about what is it we want to achieve and how can we achieve this. I think this linear thinking of, okay, this person wrote a piece of code and it was that piece of code that made a mistake and then caused this effect. That's just too short-sighted. It's not going to work in such a complex environment. I don't have the solution to that. And again, I think here's where I really feel like Switzerland has the right stance, in that it says we really need to continue clarifying these issues. We need this discussion to be ongoing. There is no simple answers to this. And And I think, well, obviously there is simple answers, but they're not going to cut it. And I'm actually thinking that the Geneva Dialogue is one little tiny piece in this puzzle that it helps us to come to clarity, because in the Geneva Dialogue, we have these people from various different stakeholder groups that bring in their thoughts so that we can develop a better picture of our roles and responsibilities.
Thank you so much for you both. That's really so much comprehensive overview of the different challenges. There's so much to explore further. Before wrapping up, I just wanted to give one more time to each of you, maybe to wrap up with some concluding remarks, both either on a pessimistic or more optimistic note.
I'll go first because I'll be short, and I want to give Serge all the credit anyway, because he's really shown a lot of leadership, not just in the industries he's worked at, but across many ecosystems and many different type environments. I'm an optimist. I firmly believe that humans are going to succeed, that there's good in all of us. And I've seen great strides in software security. The standard best practices work all the time, and companies are evolving and taking advantage of them. The complexity of it for a successful attack has gotten way more difficult for the bad guys. You don't hear about grandmothers being ransomware any longer. It's not making the news because most of that gets filtered out through automation, through machine learning, and by educating users, to not click on links or something like that, because that's still the most common way for an individual to be heard, is that we accidentally give away our password to the wrong person or something like that. So I believe in humanity. I thank you for having us, Anastasia, and I'll hand it to Serge to give his feedback, which
I share this optimistic view. When I usually give one of my doom and gloom cybersecurity talks, and people always ask me, "You're still doing e-banking?" And I am doing e-banking. So I'm reasonably confident. I do think, however, that we have some challenges facing society and also kind of the community of states. These are serious problems, and we have to tackle them. And it's one of the many serious problems. There's others that are equally big. And I do think that people have to come to grips with it. I think we can find solutions, but they're not going to be for free, and it needs some work to be done. But I think it is doable.
That's truly inspiring. I will call it the actually quite realistic/optimistic view, which I really like. So that wraps our today's episode in learning more about security and cyberspace. I hope our listeners, viewers, find some insights or save some info for Googling this later. Thank you so much for this conversation, to our great guests for sharing these views. I think the views that we have touched again reminded personally to me that cyberspace and cybersecurity is so multifaceted. There's so much to explore really on different fronts. Now we need different people to be for tackling all these issues, right? So thank you for being here as well and for listening to us. If you'd like to learn more about the Geneva Dialogue and its work over the past 5 years and this year, please visit our webpage or reach out directly. We'll leave the contact info in the description. And that's all. Thank you, everyone. And until next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.